It's been well over 2 years since season 3 of The Witcher, and honestly, I don't even remember who was hunting who and why. So this time I came prepared to take notes with my own DIY Witcher book. It's dark, it's worn, maybe even a little cursed. I went with A3 Bristol paper because it's thick, durable, and requires way less effort to reach the look I wanted. Some may call it laziness. I prefer to think of it as efficiency. I don't have a bone folder, so I used an IKEA kids knife instead. Finally, a use for that silly thing they make you buy as part of the set with the other utensils. 4 papers in every signature made me 24 signatures and a sore wrist. I flipped half of it and pressed it in my improvised device made of 2 cutting boards and some leftover game cubes I glued at the bottom. After a night rest, it was ready for some sewing. I made a mark 12 millimeters from each end and 3 more marks at the remaining space in equal distance from each other. I made a diagonal line that was meant to make sure the order of the signature is kept. Instead, it was only confusing me into making extra holes. Thinking back, I should have used a different color for it. To another improvised device I made of an old toddler's bed and a cutting board, I tied 5 twisted paper strings and started sewing with a waxed thread. From the back into the first hole and out at the next, around the paper strings and back into the same hole. I repeated this until I got to the end of the second signature, where I made a simple knot. I repeated the same pattern until I got to the end of the third signature, where I inserted my needle under the previous signature and pulled until a loop was created. I inserted the needle into the loop and tightened. This will be repeated at the end of every signature from here on. Once the sewing was done, I applied some glue and a piece of monk's cloth over it. After another layer of glue, I let it rest for the night again with a thread tightening the cloth into place. So basically what I have right now is a skeleton of a book. It still needs a soul, personality, or at least some color to make it look old. To stain the sides of the book, I diluted some acrylic ochre yellow and used the paintbrush over a net to make it spray on the book, and the wall, and the floor, and my computer. Anyway, I did the same thing with acrylic burnt sienna, only without pressing record for some reason, but it did turn out pretty nice in my opinion. For the headband, I used a piece of leather band that was left from my first video and a black and purple threads that were originally meant for bracelet making. I tied them together and attached the needle. I started out in the first hole in the middle of my first signature, over and again into the same hole. Then I looped around the leather only. I swapped the threads, black over purple, and looped around the leather with black. I repeated the loop twice with each color, occasionally sewing into the signature to help tighten and steady my work. Then I cut off the extra leather and glued the ends. I punched some holes into my cloth and pulled my paper strings through. I did the same thing with my front and back cardboard. I glued the paper threads on the outside of the cardboard. Then I glued the monk's cloth on the inside of the cardboard. Nothing says Witcher more than fake shiny leather and an unreasonable amount of rivets. So I went to my local secondhand store and got this absolute masterpiece of a coat. I'd better hurry up and use it before the 80s call and ask for it back, because once I'm done with it, we're going way further back in time. I measured and cut the fabric. Luckily, I managed to get a piece with no stitches and such. I marked the middle with a chalk to make sure I glued it straight. I left about an inch with no glue at the edges so I could fold in the fabric later. Again, I tied a thread to make sure it glued tightly in place. After waiting a few more hours, it was time to glue the front and the back. Once this has dried, I cut the excess fabric at the head and fold it in with some glue. I used my plastic kid's knife to tuck it in nicely. Even though I did try to use parchment paper every time I wasn't sure if my glue was dry, I still managed to glue my front page to the cardboard. Luckily, that was the only thing that went wrong. So far. I cut the edges of my fabric to the thickness of my ruler, which is about an inch. Then I trimmed the corners. And now, you guessed it, some more gluing. I'm not big in planning projects ahead. I'm more of a make it up as I go kind of person. But I did know I wanted the Witcher logo on the front of my book. I had a few ideas in mind, but once I found out somebody already made a 3D printable version of it, it immediately became my favorite idea. Why? Because it's easy. And I love easy. I took the pieces outside and primed them white. Once that was dried, I sprayed it silver, and after that came a black wash. I took the time arranging the parts while looking at a reference picture. I sincerely doubted I could glue all the parts on correctly, but I was determined to try. Now, I wouldn't say it came out perfect, but at least it wasn't as terrible as I feared it would be, except for the bloody bird wing that just insists on sticking out no matter how many times I tried to glue it flat. I also wanted some rivet on my book, so I took some off an old belt and glued them on. I also glued a smaller Witcher symbol on the back. Next comes something I should have done way sooner, but I forgot. So now I'm gluing some black Bristol paper, making it way harder than it would have been if I did it at the correct order. Probably would have looked nicer too. I thought it would be cool to see a map of the Witcher world when you open the book, so I printed one on a scroll pattern paper and glued it on the inside. The last thing I did was to cut out some thick black ribbon and glue it on the inside of the back cover to use as bookmark. I had a lot of fun making a book for the first time. It's not perfect, and I definitely made a lot of mistakes, but mistakes are the best way to get better. So let's take a better look at how it turned out.